in the current lecture, and he has also another piece here that has not yet reached the battlefield in North Africa. And I'll leave it to George to describe that. Now, as we ended up last time, we finished up with the Russian counteroffensive. Oh, and I'm sorry, let me do one thing, and that is for those of you on Zoom, please mute your computer so we don't have ancillary noise cutting in.
February 15th in Charleston, South Carolina. Danielle Kurtzleben, NPR News.
That's part of what I'm referring to. I'm hearing conversations that are competing with the lecture.
And by a quarter percentage point, the highest level in 50 years.
Can you mute everybody?
Of inflation.
You can mute folks.
Expensive to borrow.
Well, what am I hearing?
Sure.
Well, the Biden.
People, if you're on Zoom, please mute. I'm hearing stock reports. All right. As we concluded in the previous set of lectures that predated these, I had taken this into a part of the North African campaign, dealing with what had happened when the Italians initially started to invade Egypt and were quickly rebuffed by the British, and in fact, driven all the way back across Libya, where a good part of the Italian army was captured by being cut off at a place called Beit Afam. The remnants were able to retreat towards Tunisia, and a call quickly went out to Hitler to provide additional troops and support for the Italian army there to prevent them from being totally disrupted. Hitler at the time was willing to commit some troops, but it was very limited because he was already in the process of planning and organizing for Operation Barbarossa, which I covered in the last two lectures, and which, as you may recall, involved nearly 3 million Germans on that particular front, along with massive amounts of equipment. Nonetheless, probably the biggest advantage that Hitler could offer the Italians in North Africa was a fellow by the name of Erwin Rommel. And in order to support the Italians properly, there were a number of other things that had to happen for Rommel to be effective. Now, in this particular slide, what I try to show is not something, again, where your particular understanding of details matters, but what it's trying to do is to show you that in order for any general to be successful, something I beat on repeatedly in all these lectures is the logistical element. Without a proper understanding of the logistical support available to either side, it becomes almost impossible to understand how certain things turned out the way they did. Not that supplies are the only answer. You have to have a very capable, talented leadership in order to integrate the supplies, the weaponry, and all the rest into a combat effective force. And I've talked about doctrine repeatedly as well. One of the reasons I just try to show these things is that here's something that normally in the Eastern Front, or even on the Western Front later in the war, we don't have to think much about, and that's water consumption. So when you look at this, recognizing that obviously North Africa is primarily a desert area, very arid, this wasn't a battle that swirled around oases. That might have happened back in the 1800s, but it wasn't going to happen here. Here, you had to bring your water with you. And over the distances that we're discussing, literally hundreds, even up to 1,000+ miles of distance, you can begin to see in this lower section of water consumption, desert conditions per man per day, the minimum would be 2 to 3 gallons, which you could sustain only for a short period of time. Now, I could go through from a medical perspective and discuss the effects of dehydration and how we blow off water every time we breathe and the rest of it. That isn't the point here. The point is that just to sustain an individual in those environments, it takes 2 to 3 gallons of water a day. Now imagine you have a force of, say, 200,000. Well, that's 200,000 times 2 to 3, okay. 400 to 600,000 gallons. You can kind of get an idea of the volume that takes, as well as the tonnage that's involved. And then that doesn't take into account, even if you're at normal, or if you're needing to cook and wash. Now, cooking can be a problem that you should have water for. You can't have dehydrated food and expect to eat it without water. And if it's a non-dehydrated food, it means it has water content in it. So these are the kinds of things that add up over time and create enormous stress on the logistical supplies that are required. And as we talk about the long distances that are going to be involved here, and you think about how much transportation is available, and you only have basically one road, except that you can travel cross country at greater fuel expenditures, this all begins to add up to an enormously complex problem. Okay, so from that standpoint, the other issue that we tend to forget is you have to build things, not just fortifications, but often you have to repair culverts and bridges or the road itself that's been bombed and torn up, and things of this nature that play a great role in also what is required in your support if you're going to move an army forward. Now, this slide I showed in the last presentation, and I bring it up again here because I want to emphasize again the importance of oil. And if you'll notice down here that there are refineries and oil fields even on this east part of Egypt, much less the areas of the Middle East and Near East here that represent the endpoints for pipelines. These are important in terms of the strategic goals that are established by both sides to a fair degree. I just want us looking at this. Now, combat is certainly responsible for a lot of damage to vehicles. Nobody can really question that. But you can also suffer great losses simply by traversing rough or difficult ground, and you're going to wear out parts in the process. In North Africa, as in the Eastern Front, losses were particularly severe because armor represented the most powerful force you could put out on the battlefield. Independent of infantry, it didn't do as well. But in a combined force with infantry, artillery, air power, and armor, great things could be accomplished with relatively small forces. Now, when a side takes damage, not all of those vehicles are destroyed completely. They can be repaired. But if you lose control of the battlefield, if you're forced to retreat, then you may not be able to recover those damaged vehicles sufficiently. In order to recover those vehicles, what do you need? You need other forms of transport that are not bringing supplies up. They're simply there to recover a damaged vehicle, such as you're seeing down here. This vehicle might be taken back to a shop where it can be repaired. When I talked about this on the Eastern Front, one of the great logistical problems for the Germans was the damaged vehicles, especially the tanks, had to be sent all the way back to Germany, and this created an enormous strain. Here in North Africa, you won't find much information about where these repairs were to be taking place, but generally they had to go back a good distance, or they had to be blown up on the battlefield so the enemy couldn't use them. Now, I mentioned about good leadership. Probably anyone who's paid any attention to World War II history is aware of this gentleman, Erwin Rommel. He got his first real start in World War II when Germany invaded France, and he was in charge of something called the Ghost Division because he was so rapid in his advance and so aggressive in his actions that the French literally had trouble finding him at times on the battlefield. And in fact, so did Hitler for that reason. And there were a number of controversies that arose as a result. But because of his aggressiveness and his leadership, particularly literally from the front, and because of his overall talent, he was able to accomplish great things with relatively limited force. And he lived until 1944, when he committed suicide as a result of being involved in the July 20 plot to kill Hitler. And there's some question about how that happened. Now, again, beating on the logistical issues a bit more, what I want to do is just show here, this is petrol, oil, lubricants, right, for combat and non-combat vehicles. And it shows you the kind of consumption that took place over a relatively short distance. So you had to have a lot of stuff near the front line once you were penetrating. Remember, the distances we're talking about in North Africa are considerable. These aren't just short forays of 2 and 3 miles and so on. You're talking about deep penetrations, but you get out to a certain level, you literally run out of gas. Now, one of the other things that's just not readily available for you to read, I think, from this distance, but I'll just point it out, is that motorized divisions had about 5 men per vehicle. 1,000 men equals 50 vehicles, and so on. Consumption calculated over roads cross country would use the same amount of fuel for about half the distance. Most of what happened in North Africa happened off-road. So the fuel consumptions escalate under those particular situations. Similarly, again, not easily read here, and I'm not planning to read it. It just gives you an idea of the different tank types that were involved in this conflict. Now, the so-called infamous Tiger tank and the Panther tank, the Marks 5 and 6, were not available to the German-Italian army in 1941, 42. It really wasn't until 43, when they'd been driven back to Tunisia, that you begin to see the appearance of some of these tanks. The other issue that's important whenever you're reading personal histories is that after about 1943, every German tank was thought to be a Tiger. And that's largely because of a misappreciation of what the Mark IV was upgunned to become. We're not going to go into that. I just don't want everyone thinking every German tank was a Tiger. It's just not at all the truth. All right. The other reason for showing this is to show, in one sense, why there was an ebb and flow across North Africa. It wasn't just that somebody got beat in a particular battle. What it had to do with how your forces could be reconstructed only after a period of hiatus of just waiting for supplies to arrive. And while it may seem that crossing the Mediterranean in terms of distance was not all that difficult, as we'll point out a little bit further on in the lecture, there were enormous difficulties getting supplies across the Mediterranean for both sides. And this had to do with the terrain considerations and who held what territory and how much emphasis would be put on trying to interrupt those supplies. So again, the idea behind this slide is just to give you a concept of how force structures change. Now, this is German, but it was also true to a fair degree for the British as well. Now, again, not something that I expect you to be able to read, but I use this because it points out some of the things that are important. Sea lift of supplies and personnel to North Africa, 1940 to 43, all right, by Italian shipping into Libya and into Tunisia. And the point about these tonnages is that when you begin to look at how much water weighed, how much fuel weighed, how much food weighed, and all of the other ancillary equipment you need, you begin to see that how much you could load at port was not necessarily what arrived. And what you see here is failed to arrive. There was a whole percentage, almost 8% in terms of the grand total for this period of time that failed to arrive, but it went as high as 16 to 18% at times. That meant you were losing almost 1/7 to 1/8 of your supplies en route, gone forever, sunk at the bottom of the Mediterranean, arming the fishes down there. I wouldn't go deep sea fishing in the Mediterranean early after World War II. Those fish down there are heavily armed. But what this also shows you is just in terms of material and things of this nature, and it gives you an idea of what the high commands had to focus on. Just in terms of organizing this much shipping, getting those supplies to the port, getting them across the sea, getting them unloaded, and then getting them all moved forward to the front line where they were needed. All right. This gives you just an overview of the distances involved. The legend is 300 miles. Now, back down here is roughly where a lot of this stalemate took place when the Italians attacked into Egypt here and were beaten back. They were driven all the way back to here and stuck. And then the Germans came in here, came up and supported, and then Rommel launched his attacks to drive the British back. But notice that this distance all the way back almost toward the area of Cairo is 1,000 miles, all right? What do you have in the way of ports along there? Not very much. The port at Tobruk had some capability, that at Bardia had a little bit, that at Benghazi had a little bit, but these were very limited ports in terms of what they could load and offload. Now, importantly, by the summer of 41, the British had already taken a beating at Crete, all right? And they were beginning to lose control here and had to defeat the Vichy French. And they had to undo German initiatives that were trying to cause enough trouble in the rear to disrupt all where I showed you oil and supplies and piping were going to help support the British war effort. So in this situation, much was already beginning to happen. The British concentrated their forces to protect the Suez Canal because they needed this supply route coming up through the Red Sea and across the Mediterranean. But with the Germans in control here and controlling Sicily, they had two choke points where they could severely damage or interdict the British supply lines. And so the issue was often in histories emphasizing how the Germans and Italians struggled to get supplies across to North Africa. But if you look at those choke points, you realize as well, Britain had a lot of difficulty as well. And this was a very hotly contested area. Sorry. Go back up to here. Now, I mentioned this because of the access to the oil fields, and I talked a little bit about this in the previous set of lectures, not in the current one, just to again to emphasize that there was a whole lot of activity occurring in these regions in the Middle East, and the British had to commit resources, men, all the rest of it to try to control that. And part of the difficulty for the British was trying to create an overall command structure, which allowed them to integrate and balance the various needs of each of these various theaters that are involved. And these were put under one man, Wavell initially, and then Auchinleck later. And Churchill kept interfering with all of this because there were very powerful political considerations that weighed in, such as supporting Greece when the Germans and Italians invaded the Balkans, and then being driven out of Greece, and then being driven out of Crete, and so on. So all of these different political considerations are weighing in and have to be distilled down through the theater commanders. And when the theater commanders are also stuck with limited supplies, resources in order to contest the Germans and Italians in North Africa, this creates, again, part of this back and forth that you see. It's partly a matter of competence, but it's partly also just a matter of political considerations. Again, just to show here that the British were able to finally secure the control here adequately, especially after Greece and Crete fell, and that they actually had to get into some contest with the Vichy French. Now, remember also, if you were here for the previous set of lectures, when France collapsed, rather than the French government withdraw to North Africa, where they could well have been insulated from further German attacks, they surrendered. And the rump government, if you want to call it, was established in a town called Vichy. That's why it's called Vichy France, under Pétain and then under Laval. In agreement with the Germans, basically, the Vichy basically said, we're going to maintain a degree of neutrality. But that meant any incursion by any armed force would be met with armed resistance. And this happened in particular when Churchill tried to convince the Vichy government to turn its ships, its navy, over to the British. Even said, worst case scenario, send them to the Caribbean and just have them sit there. But that was not what the French did. And as a result, Churchill had his navy attack the French navy. And they actually sank a whole number of French ships so they wouldn't fall into German hands. Then on top of it, in Syria and so on, which was a French mandate after World War I, they actually had to fight them to some degree to regain control and keep control over the oil fields and the pipelines. It also meant later on with Operation Torch, when the Allies eventually invade North Africa, that the Americans are put up against the Vichy French because they don't have the same degree of animosity towards each other. And it was thought that if the British invaded Casablanca, for example, that this would end up in a vicious firefight. And they didn't want that to happen. So I just mention these things because the complexities of what we're dealing with here, I'm simplifying to an enormous degree. But it's important for all of us through all of these lectures to keep that little bit of a hint of what's going on globally, or at least within the region of Europe and North Africa, to understand how these things unfold and why they unfold the way they do. Because one of the other points I'm going to make as we go is, what other choices were there? How could one have managed this differently? Now, this particular thing shows the supply route for Britain from the oil fields, resources from India, keeping the lines open. And again, all of these show where there were different conflicts that were arising over the importance of the Mediterranean. And one of the key places here is Malta. Now, I'm going to digress for a moment because I want to emphasize a couple of points that I just made a few moments ago. All right, Sicily is not very far from Tunis. All right, certainly within aircraft range pretty easily. So if the Germans and Italians established a decent air force here, they would be able to cut that supply line, interdict it pretty severely. Now, that doesn't mean every ship going through there is going to get bombed and sunk, all right? There's always going to be some survivors, but you can increase the attrition rate considerably by doing that. If you have Crete, again, you're not too far from the North African coast. So you have a second place where you can challenge the British and any of the supplies that are supposed to go through here. Now, Britain held Gibraltar, which was absolutely key. And remember that Spain had a sort of mixed relationship with Germany. They maintained a political neutrality, even though there was a whole Spanish unit that was formed and sent to the Eastern Front later on. But we're not going to fuss about that. Just basically, they maintained a level of neutrality. And therefore, the British, who held on to Gibraltar, had access to the sea here. Many historians, and myself included to a fair degree, feel that Malta was also another critical site that, had the Germans and Italians controlled it, would have severely disrupted the ability of the British to transmit supplies across the Mediterranean. It never fell to the Germans. They had some plans to do that, but after the debacle at Crete to their paratroop units, which were devastated in that particular arrangement, they felt that they could not really muster the naval forces for a direct amphibious invasion, and they didn't want to sacrifice more of their paratroopers, highly trained, motivated people, to try to take Malta. So they tried to pound it into submission with air power. And they came pretty close to doing that, but Malta hung on. And after a lot of give and take and reinforcements sent by the British, including bringing carriers which would fly planes to Malta and then exit back out the Mediterranean, they could keep this as a viable spot. And what it provided for Britain was to again interdict Italian and German transports across the Mediterranean. If you've lost Crete, and you don't have Sicily, and you don't have Sardinia and Corsica up here, then this becomes a privileged waterway. But if you hold Malta, you can still interdict with considerable effectiveness. And that indeed was what was happening. I think that the Germans might have done well to have committed more resources to it. Okay. Wavell was in charge in 40 when things were first unfolding and into 41, as you'll see here. And this just again is another one showing we're a distance of 150 miles from El Aghelia here. And there's Alamein, there's Cairo over there. But this is where the bulk of the fighting took place in early 41. And this is after the Italians, excuse me, had been driven back. Rommel's first foray with the Italians was a rapid advance that caught the British off guard because they had diverted troops to the Middle East and to Greece and to Crete, as I pointed out earlier. So in terms of the time relationships, we want to keep this involved. And again, if you look at the time frame, this is March, April, May, 41 down here to June. What was happening in Europe? Hitler's getting ready to invade Russia. Can he send a lot of stuff to North Africa? No. He already got diverted into the Balkans in order to crush any opposition there. But once he had finished that and had to delay the Operation Barbarossa from May into June, you can see that there's a lot not showing on this map that has an effect on what's going on. But even with those limited resources, Rommel's able to invade all across northern Libya, Cyrenaica, and catch the British. Here at Tobruk, they're surrounded, primarily an Australian group. He drives them back, sorry. This shows you again, just the distances and importance of air cover. The idea behind it is to show how aircraft play a role in interdicting and supporting. This is just in terms of supplies and what's going to play a role, sorry, in where this is going. This is a little bit more showing how the Axis lines of communication, all right, through here, but there's Malta, okay? So even if they're going across here, you'd have to get your supplies from Tunis all the way through the coast road. Now look at the distance, 300 miles. So 300, 600, 900, 1200, 1500 if you're coming from Tunis, roughly. Think of the wear and tear on your vehicles and what that's going to mean in this kind of condition. But if you can get them to Benghazi, you've only got maybe 300 miles or less. If you have Tobruk, it's even better. And even Tripoli, you're closer by a good deal. So while you could get your troops and your supplies maybe more safely here, you had to traverse this huge distance to get to the front. And that highlights the importance of Malta. If Malta had been taken, now you've secured this whole area. This is your sea right here. And that means you can just bring your supplies down much more closely to the front. Okay. This just shows, again, some of the variable amounts of supplies and what happened over different times. Average monthly supplies, February, June, 41, 90,000 tons, drops to 60,000 back up here. And look at July, December, 42, down to 50 plus. All of this had to do with what was costing time and energy and resources, because what didn't make it is at the bottom of the Mediterranean. And what's happening in February, June, well, you're just gearing up for Operation Barbarossa. July, December, remember we covered that? What happened to the German army and the Russian army in that particular set of time is enormous resources had to be consumed and used in fighting. You don't have that much left that you can send to North Africa, plus what you're losing in that particular time of trying to get them there. So I bring these things out again to show comparison issues. Notice though, in July of 42, the Axis got more supplies than the British. Again, it's worth emphasizing, this wasn't an imbalance where the British always got more than the Italians and Germans. Didn't always work out that way. It depended on a whole lot of circumstances as to what was happening. Notice in September, look at the difference. 42, okay? Why is this important? Because this is where Rommel reaches his maximum extent in 42. We'll talk about that a little later as we go on. Now, just to point out, Rommel in 41 launches an attack against the British, and he drives them back very, very quickly across Cyrenaica drives them almost to the border with Egypt, way over here. Here's the coast road, here's the port of Tobruk, and it is cut off by the Germans, and they launch several attacks in order to try to penetrate it and take the port. The Australians hang on, and they hang on because they can still get supplies by ship, right? And because they built a defensive structure that seems to work pretty well in resisting the German attacks. A little bit further on, after Tobruk is surrounded, the British try to relieve it, as you would want normally. So they launched an attack called Operation Brevity. And this occurs at this particular point. I want to emphasize this. I talked about it in the last series of lectures, but I want to emphasize it here. Halfaya Pass is a critical place, often called by the British Hellfire Pass, because it was important in allowing the coast road to cross this, what's called an escarpment. If you want an example of an escarpment, go to the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, for example, and come at it from the east, and you'll say they're not very high, all right? Those are not big mountains, but they are very steep-sided. And when you get up close, you realize that no vehicle's going up that slope, right? You need to cut through a pass if you're going to bring vehicles through. Men might be able to climb it and get over to the top, but beyond that, they're cut off from any real supply. So that serves as an almost impenetrable barrier that prevents you from doing anything terribly aggressive unless you come around the escarpment on this direction. And if you do that, in this case, your coastal column and these that are on the other side of the escarpment cannot support each other, right? They're individual. That means you could theoretically defeat each in detail. You can cut the pass so they can't come up it while you destroy these guys. And then once you've destroyed them, then these guys have nowhere to go except back.
Hey, Doc, could you use your cursor to show where you're pointing?
Yeah, Hellfire Pass is right here. This is the escarpment that we're
See
seeing
that?
here.
When you're not showing the cursor on the map.
The cursor isn't, oh, I see. I'm sorry, got it. You're correct. Here's Hellfire Pass. And here's the escarpment. So if you can't come up through Hellfire Pass, the guys here are on their own. And if you muster enough force to defeat these guys have no choice but to retreat. They have no place to go. And it's easy to cut them off here because this is very steep and narrow, which means a few defensive guns, some modest fortifications, some minefields, they can't get through there very easily at all. So that's a critical part of what's going on here. And indeed, this was a brief operation and resulted in a bloody nose for the British. So they tried again in mid-June of 41 with the same kind of consequences. They took some time to rebuild their forces. The Germans and Italians are on the end of a long supply line. It's a problem for the Germans, but at the same time, technically, that is from a standpoint of doctrine and just tactical competence, again, the British are beaten back within a relatively short period of time. And after something like this happened, Churchill is very unhappy with Wavell. Tobruk is still cut off. So finally, with Wavell replaced, the British put together what's called Operation Crusader. Now here, what you'll tend to notice is how much broader this attack is. In other words, instead of some narrow armored thrust near the escarpment on the upside of it, as opposed to the coast side, now you've broadened that area out. Here you're trying to use your numbers to disrupt and dismay the German defenders. And indeed, this becomes a very complex, swirling set of movements that occur through this time. And these maps just simply show, a little bit of the complexity of what's going on. Desert warfare has been considered to be analogous to war at sea. The terrain considerations are there, and they are relatively important. As George Cummings pointed out in the very first set of lectures, one of the things Rommel did was he would get his 88s, the flak guns, if you will, these high velocity weapons that were used for anti-aircraft, but he learned very quickly how effective they could be against ground targets. And he would hide them in these small folds of the ground, small folds that to the rest of us look like a flat plane, but they could just have the guns sitting up just high enough so they could shoot out over this plain area, but be relatively well protected from coming fire towards them. And he would send tanks out and he would engage the British. Remember that the German tanks were not very well gunned at this point, all right? So they would start engaging some of the British tanks, and then they would hightail it back, being chased by the British. And what would happen? The 88s would start taking them out. at 1,000 yards, 1,500 yards, long before the British tanks could engage them. And then they had poor targets on top of it. So these battles swirled around, as you can see, and at different times, each was surrounded. This just got to be a crazy time frame. But after a bit, Operation Crusader was successful in drawing the Germans into a swirling battle, using up their resources, and eventually the Germans had to retreat and Tobruk was relieved. What I'd like to show in this, as I did with some of the photographs that I showed on the Eastern Front, is look at that distant horizon. And we look at it as civilians and we say, that looks pretty flat. I mean, I can see armored vehicles out here at hundreds of yards distance, and it looks to me like, you know, this is just flat ground. These little folds escape us until you're actually walking across it and realizing that a little drop here and a little drop there can hide an emplacement. The other important part of this, of course, is that now this German tank, for example, has been abandoned. So it's a complete loss. You can't get it back where you can repair it. And the British would probably not bother with this. They'd probably just blow it up rather than try to do anything with it themselves. Again, sort of another idea from viewed from atop a tank, and it gives you some idea of the terrain, and you begin to see a little bit of the irregularities in the ground here. And in this middle distance, if you just dug a trench through there, you could be down pretty well, not seen very easily because you're not showing up big heaps of dirt and everything. But if you're infantry coming across and somebody has a machine gun, such as George is going to demonstrate here very shortly, don't worry, it's not functioning. Then you begin to understand just how difficult fighting in North Africa would be. Yes.
Michael, at this stage, what kind of tanks are the English using?
They're using Matildas and Crusaders. They have relatively good front armor, but they have relatively lightweight guns.
Okay.
And their mechanical reliability was kind of so-so. In 42, they begin to get American
Shermans.
Grants and Shermans.
Yeah.
The Grant has a sponson mounted 75 millimeter on the side. It's a peculiar arrangement of the tank. And the Lee also was used, which had, I think, a 45 millimeter in a turret on top along with the main gun. I sometimes get those confused. But the actual Sherman that we're so familiar with was a little bit later. A little bit later.
Thank you.
Firefly.
And again, the Germans were relying on Mark IIIs and Mark IVs. The Mark IVs were getting better gunned, so they had longer range and greater penetration, but they were still not upgunned to the degree they were going to be in 43 and in 44. And the Mark IV in particular lasted through the entire war. It's a very capable tank for the Germans. Auchinleck got the nod after Wavell is relieved. He was given all of these responsibilities that I want to show you, because as a commander, the focus in most of what we're talking about is his effectiveness in this region that's highlighted in that rectangular box. But he had to consider a great many other places, and he had to respond to those needs. And it became an enormous stress as well, particularly in 42 when Rommel struck again. I'm going to stop here. George, I want you to come up and demonstrate what we have here. That's the camera.
Yeah, and it's on there. If you stop your screen share,
Okay.
then that we can pin that camera.
Turn on the lights, please.
Yeah. I'm going to literally pick this up. Okay. Can I unscrew it? George, go to it. We'll figure it out.
Okay, so let's stay on the African campaign. With some of the stuff that I brought that would have been part of that. First, I'll show you this pendant. This is actually of the Africa Corps. You recognize the palm tree with the swastika was the accepted symbol, but this is the actually a pendant for the 21st Panzer tank regiment that fought specifically in that campaign. Staying with Africa, Michael made it very clear about supply. So this is an actual jerry can, 1943 Wehrmacht. So one of the few items that I've ever found that's actually marked with the Wehrmacht, again, 43. So interestingly, this was everything to the troops through the war. In Africa, if this had a white cross, it was for water. Because that was one of the problems that they had, as Michael pointed out, was water, 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 water. And so this was the method that they had, but mixing water into a can that had gasoline was not going to be very exciting. So that was the way. So if you
And that actually happened at times. It actually did.
So if you see pictures of these jerry cans and you see one with a white cross, that was for water. Michael referenced the British tanks. This is an actual 6-pounder, roughly 50 millimeter standard tank and anti-tank round used by the British. Just a solid head, no explosive power. This baby was just to try to pop a hole through that tank and bounce around and kill everybody. And so that would be very typical of that. This is the MG-34. This is quite a beast. If you come on up later, you can kind of give this a little bit of a lift. Just be careful that the barrel is very heavy. And the problem, it was developed in 1934, therefore the MG-34. It fired the standard 7.92 millimeter, 8 millimeter Mauser round. Here are some examples. These are not live. This is an actual German World War II machine gun belt that would have fed this. You also have this canister, Africa Corps, the tan Africa Corps color. This would have had 50 of these rounds in this, and this would have attached to the side of a machine gun. You could have had an empty one over here that would have collected the rounds after they were spent, but this would be another way to feed the gun. This is a barrel, extra barrel carrier, because you can imagine at the rate of fire of these machine guns, the barrel would overheat. Once that barrel overheated, its accuracy would come off because the barrel would expand. And so this gun was designed, and if you come on up and take a look, you'll notice this point here. This is a hinge. And there's a little button underneath here that if you hit that button, it flips open and exposes the inside barrel. And so that's how they would have replaced the barrel. There's actually a glove, mitt. I haven't bought one yet. I know where I can get one. But there was a mitt that the machine gun operator or his assistant would use to immediately pull out that barrel and put in a new barrel. And so again, that's what this machine gun team would practice and know how to do. The problem with the MG-43 was that this is all machined. That's why it's so heavy. And it's just wonderful, typical German machining if you come on up and take a look. And also you'll notice the DOT, this the manufacturer, and the date 1945. Interestingly, my friends, this barrel, you can see it just underneath the rear sight is the star. This machine gun, not all of this, but this barrel section found its way into the Israeli military after the war, because so much of the German material, believe it or not, was bought up by Israel to defend them. This has an aircraft sight, which actually clips right onto this center section here. So now it can be set up in a tripod arrangements high up, so it can be used for anti-aircraft activity. Book here.
George, before you leave that.
Yep.
Rounds per minute and range.
Well, the range was typical of a 7.92, 200 to 800 yards was potential. Rate of fire of this bad boy was around 800 to 900. The MG42, which came out in 42, was actually in excess. It was 1100 to 1200. It was considered to be Hitler's buzzsaw. The problem was it expended too much ammunition too quickly and heated up. And its method of changing out a barrel, I'm in the process of getting one made for me. Sorry, I don't have it here now, but there was a latch on the side where you would unlatch it, open it up, and boom, the barrel would pop out. But the MG42 was different in that they realized that machining all of this was too much, too expensive, too much time, too much material. And after they invaded Russia and began to see Russian armaments that were stamped, not machined, but stamped, they went back and they developed the MG42, which the front end of the MG42 is all stamped. So the way this operates is this opens up and exposes the feed mechanism for the machine gun belt. Now, the reason that this gun is legal is because this is all an aluminum block. And this piece is just, this is the arm to actuate the first round, that's just sitting in there. So that's why I'm able to own this, just in case you were concerned. But that's how they would have loaded and fed in the ammunition. Interestingly also about this gun, if you come on up and take a look, you'll notice that there are two triggers.
Yeah.
One trigger was for single shot. The bottom trigger was for fully automatic. So an operator of this gun with the sights as he has them here would be able to shoot individually at a target. And then with just dropping his finger down, he could then go to fully automatic. So again, the gun had tremendous capability and tremendous.
George, the gun looks very heavy. Was it shot off a tripod or shoulder?
Oh, this is the bipod.
Oh, okay.
So
I-
here's
no,
the bipod system
Got
right
it.
here.
Okay.
And this is, I don't have this part. Let's see if I get that down. Come on. Yeah. So it's released here. So there's your methodology of the weapon. Yes, sir.
Was it gas operated, the firing
Yeah,
unit?
quite. Everything's gas operated. What's interesting, the Germans are pretty smart about this. This bipod actually comes back, folds back together again, and it just simply has a couple of pieces that it latches right back into the bottom here. And boom, now you're running with the gun. But like I said, thank goodness for soldiers that are 18, 19, 20 years old, because it's very heavy. Again, if you want to come on up and lift it, that's fine. Just be aware this is very heavy, the front section of the gun. Okay, so moving right along, this is an actual artillery round canister. Believe it or not, this was a Doug piece. I bought this out of Ukraine. They're still very active on the internet. Interesting.
How much do they cost?
Well, this particular guy was $90. That's the good news. The bad news is it cost me $90 to get it shipped to Binghamton, New York. But very interestingly, it's in great shape, still has its tan paint, still has its fully operational latches. And I brought for you a Wikipedia. This particular container held rounds for the 7.5 centimeter infantry support cannon. And so you can take a look at it and see what that's all about. Yeah, centimeter, 75 millimeter. So going back to Russia, and let's talk about the Panther. I brought a little toy for you. First of all, I brought this model. There's a Panther tank right there. Very long 75 millimeter gun. By the way, became a problem in Europe. in the West because the Germans found themselves fighting in lovely French villages quite a bit. And that long barrel was a real detriment to fighting in a city because it hit the walls. And guys, there it is. That's an actual full 75mm Panther battlefield round right there. Obviously, it doesn't have any powder in it, but that's right off the battlefield. This tank carried 79 of those bad boys.
Wow.
Between armor piercing, which this happens to be, and high explosive, which again would have been against human targets. Going back to Russia, I brought this little gem. This is what's known as the Arrowhead. This is Russian 45mm. Reason I bought this is very interestingly, this piece here, which is expendable in how this works, basically busts up when it hits the vehicle side, but it hopefully opens up enough of a hole for that chunk of tungsten to then pierce through.
George, come this way.
Yeah, bounce around the turret and kill everybody in it. So if you notice, the way this is shaped looks a little bit similar to some of what you might have seen today in today's round. And so sure enough, this was the precursor to a lot of what you see today, which again is really designed high velocity. This destructs when it hits, but it opens up enough of a hole for that internal piece to penetrate and then bounce around the hull, killing everybody inside. Pretty crazy. My other toy, this is a 37mm anti-aircraft gun. I'll bring it over. It's on a tracked vehicle, as you can recognize. But the reason I brought this is because this is the round that it fires right here. So Michael talked one of the previous times about the 37mm, 45mm were kind of door knockers on the tanks, the heavier tanks. But believe it or not, this bad boy firing this at the rapidity that it was able to do, yeah, it's going to knock on your door pretty good, but it's going to penetrate that hull pretty soon if enough of these hit. And so again, standard anti-aircraft, anti-vehicle 37-round mobile system that the Germans developed. These two gems are 20mm. You've probably seen the single 20mm flak gun or the quad 20mm. Again, initially developed as anti-aircraft. However, they were fantastic on ground targets. If you're in a vehicle, light-skinned vehicle, you do not want to get hit by these guys, especially coming out of a quad setup, because that's an awful lot of lead coming at you. This would have been anti-tank or anti-vehicle. It's a solid shot piece. And so again, very typical. This little gem was more typical in the aircraft defense, because this actually has a fuse on it. This unscrews, and depending upon the type, there were multiple of these fuses that were created by the Germans. Delayed or impact were a couple of examples of them. And then you had the actual warhead. Come on up and take a look. This actually has the German insignia stamped on it, which is why I bought that. If you ever find these yellow like that, you're going to pay a little extra, especially if they've got the Waffen mark on them, which this one does. This was famous for was being used in the aircraft, German assault aircraft against B-52s, B-17s, 24s, and British Lancasters. And what this bad boy would do is it would penetrate the aluminum skin of the aircraft, and it would then explode inside. Once it penetrated that aluminum space, it would explode inside and kill anything and everybody that it was around. There are actual photos that you can find on YouTube of planes that were hit, and it hit and it would create a hole about yay big. But on the other side of the fuselage, it would be all ripped apart because this would all fracture and shrapnel, and it still had a tremendous amount of velocity to it. And if it didn't hit somebody or something, it would blow out a handful of pieces of the other side of the fuselage. So imagine a bomber being hit by a handful of these, you had some real problems.
Now, when you see a squadron of bombers going through a flat field and the black puffs, that's what's coming from the
No.
yellow part.
Those are 88s. Those are
Oh,
the German
okay.
88. This is strictly being loaded into a Messerschmitt or a Falcon.
Okay.
This is being loaded into the planes, okay? Or on tracked vehicles like this, from the ground, shooting at, attacking, strafing, American, British or American or Russian fighters. But those black puffs, those are the 88. Now, let's talk about that for a minute, because last time I was here, I brought you an 88. And the Germans had a very, very interesting arrangement. It was amazing, the computer system that they had for determining exactly the height of the planes and the speed of the planes and so on and so forth. They could pinpoint, and they had it computerized, believe it or not, to 4 88s. That was a battery, that was considered a battery. And that information would be programmed by these 5 guys looking through this device and figuring out exactly where the flight program was coming. And they could send the information to the 4 88s. And they would then send up the rounds. They never aimed at a plane, never aimed at a plane. They simply were aiming at where they were being told by that computer to aim. And that 88 would explode, and all of the shrapnel from that 88 round was what was destroying the plane. Yeah, very, very seldom that an 88 specifically hit a plane. It was all the shrapnel from it.
Can I ask one real dumb question? You talk about Messerschmitts, they were armed with so many machine guns and a cannon.
Right.
What's the difference between a machine gun and a cannon, which also could fire multiple rounds at a time, not multiple rounds sequentially? That's what.
Well, some of the planes, when they talk about cannon, it was generally a 37 millimeter.
Okay,
They call it tank busters, okay? Otherwise, the Messerschmitts, if they were upgunned to the 20 millimeter.
Okay.
Remember that American fighters weren't using 30 caliber ammunition, they were using 50
50,
caliber,
yeah,
which is some pretty equivalent to these. This is actually a little bit bigger than a 50 caliber. So this is what the planes are using. The American planes, British planes are using 50 caliber. And then a cannon is gonna be this size.
And Bob, the other part of this has to do with the caliber that is below a certain number, below a 1 inch would generally be considered machine gun, because they also have a much higher rate of fire. So the rate of fire of a 20 millimeter was considerably less than that of a 50 cal.
Yeah.
Just as an example.
thank you.
And the other part that one of our people wanted to know about is how much did a jerry can weigh full?
Well, good question.
It was 5 gallons,
Well, it's 5 gallons.
Yeah,
and each
5
gallon
times 4,
is-
But
40 pounds.
you've got, I gotta believe you got a difference between fuel and water. There's gotta be a difference.
There is some.
Weight.
There is some, but it's not a huge difference.
No, but yeah,
And the way you can break it down is a gallon is 64 fluid ounces, right?
A pint's a pound,
Well,
the world around.
there you go. Right, so that's a nice way to do it as well. And a pint is 16 ounces, right? So if you want to do it in terms of that, you're talking about how you're going to break that number down. Okay,
And then we also have a couple of gems that were brought in. So this is again, very typical German helmet, the M35, M40 style. It's a standard process of comfort to the head, marked with the Wehrmacht typical symbol. And then you've got a ceremonial sword, quite nice, by the way. Come on up and take a look. Look, excuse me, it's got a very nice pattern on the top here, and then the brass inlays here and here. And so, again, very ceremonial, but the mark of an officer within the, in this case, the Nazi party. So,
All right, are there any questions from anyone else, Tom, that called in?
Yeah.
All right, obviously, this is an incredible display, and it gives us an opportunity to understand some of the physical requirements also that go down to every soldier. And as George mentioned, when you pick this up, this is not a lightweight gun. So if you think about that as just one piece of your personal equipment, and you're walking across a battlefield, not running, across a desert plain, which is relatively even, but it's still a little bit uneven in terms of footing, plus your personal equipment, plus the other guy is carrying ammunition, and another guy's carrying a mortar and a base mortar plate and things of this sort. You begin to understand the physical requirements that are going on. Now, if you're dealing with a dry atmosphere as well, then your expenditure of energy and water escalates enormously. And just as a little aside, before we continue our lectures here, I want to mention that I was on a backpacking trip, and I've referenced these before. It happened to be a hot day. I was overloaded, I admit. I think my pack weighed about 60 pounds. And of course, I wasn't 20 at the time, but that doesn't matter. The point is that after about 6 or 7 miles, a good part of which included an uphill climb, I had long run out of water. And I was struggling to walk from this tree to that tree. And I would stop, and then I'd wait, and then I'd walk this tree to that tree. And finally, the guide came back and said, you know, how you doing? There's a watering place up here, just another 100, 150 yards, and you can take a break and water up. I drank 4 liters before I peed.
wow.
The point is that you get dehydrated so rapidly, and I wasn't sweating. That's the part that is extraordinary. It is just dry air. And because of the pattern of breathing, you completely hydrate the air you're breathing in order to get it down to the lungs. And you're supposed to recover a good part of that water when you exhale. But if you exhale through your mouth and you're breathing somewhat rapidly, you very quickly lose that water. And you really feel it. You really, really feel it. So you can imagine that at times supplies were so deficient that people weren't existing on what you saw as a minimum that I posted on an earlier slide. Sometimes they had less. And they had to make do with that until they could get the supplies forward. But there are physical limitations. The idea of mind over matter, that only works so far. There's a physiologic collapse point. And if you haven't got support then you're in trouble. All right, now we're going to go and get back to screen share.
We have a break.
And
I can't take that up, but we need a break.
here we go. I hope that does it.
Which time do you have?
Okay. And there we are. Okay.
What time do you have?
I got to close out a couple of little things here. All right. So Rommel gets driven away from Tobruk. He's back basically at his starting line. At this point, remember the war in the East has been going on now for a couple months. And there is very little available extra resource to send to North Africa. And yet, as the local commander, Rommel, on site is basically saying, if you send me more supplies, if you send me more troops, then I will be able to accomplish extraordinary things. And it's hard to resist that. Think about any budget process that any of you may have been involved in. And you realize that no matter what you give, there's always room for more. You'll find new programs, new ways to expend the money, new people to hire, whatever. The same is true in the military. Give me more, I can do more. Maybe. But you have to weigh all of this at the highest strategic levels because you only have a finite amount of resources, and how you're going to allocate determines a great deal of what outcomes will occur. And your allocation has to depend upon your important strategic goals. What was the strategic goal in the East, on the Eastern Front? It was to destroy the Russian armies near the frontier as best you could and reach a line from which Russian bombers could no longer threaten Germany, and that includes the Ploesti oil fields. Taking Moscow and Leningrad might help you accomplish that, but even in the beginning of Barbarossa, that was not considered the strategic goal. German generals at the time wanted that Moscow taken in particular. We talked about that last time in terms of the strategic controversy. What's the strategic point in North Africa? Is it to keep Italy in the fight? Not really. It is only in part, but the idea is that by controlling at least the central portion of the Mediterranean, the Germans protect their southern flank. They want to cut off the British supplies that can traverse the Mediterranean and bring those supplies to Britain and keep it in the fight, which is being subjected to strategic bombing. Less and less as the war in the East goes on because of the diversion of aircraft that have to be shifted there. But basically, from Hitler's perspective, and some of the most senior German generals, they're looking at it saying, what is there really for us to accomplish here, and how much resource do we have that we can send there, knowing that we're going to lose somewhere between maybe 8 and as much at one point, almost 20% of the supplies we're sending over, and accomplish something of great strategic value. Yeah, it might be nice if we can control all of North Africa, but is that realistic? So as we get into this particular second assault that Rommel is carrying out, again, he surprises the British, who've had to divert resources all over the place. Also at this time, remember that now the Japanese have attacked in the Pacific. So that again opens up a new theater, a new set of threats for Britain. And how are they going to deal with that, and how much resource can they divert to North Africa? What is the most critical point for them? Malta. They were going to do whatever they could to supply it, and protecting the Suez Canal. Those were the prime strategic considerations at that time. So the British Army, the 8th Army in North Africa, is somewhat bereft of supplies as well. And a lot of resources are being diverted elsewhere. So what happens? Rommel attacks, and again, within a relatively short period of time, traverses Cyrenaica and approaches Tobruk. But before he gets to Tobruk, the British have established a defensive line called the Gazala line, based on a town on the coast, Gazala, and ending at a location called Bir Hakim. Pardon my phlegm, but Bir Hakim, it would be an easier way for me to pronounce it. Now, because of the distances involved and the nature of support that's available to the British, instead of having a real continuous line, they tend to have what they call fireboxes. They've created enclaves or small fortifications that have artillery and infantry in there in order to stall any German onslaught. And the effectiveness of this line is particularly evident in this northern portion that you see here, when the Germans and Italians run up against it. Now, these are 5 Italian divisions here and 2 more down here. But what you'll notice is that this is an armored infantry, this is infantry, these four that just have the X in the middle are just foot infantry. Down here, you have the motorized and armored infantry columns. This is your mobility down here in the southern portion that you're seeing here. So Rommel has set things up recognizing that the northern part of this line, his left flank, is really to be held. He'll divert British attention by attacking in this area, but he doesn't have the idea that he's going to achieve any great breakthrough there. Instead, what he's going to do is he's going to concentrate his maneuver elements, and he's going to try to sweep around that line, the southern extremity of it, and get into the British rear where he can disrupt any reserves and maybe even cut off these frontline troops. Now, it doesn't quite happen that way, but this shows the general maneuvers that you can see. And indeed, he launches the maneuver attack around this southern flank. This is trackless area. There are no roads in the area. This is all cross-country work. And it means that when you start looking at the distances that are involved, that are displayed on this legend, yes, a days of fuel that you've put into your armored vehicles will certainly allow you to get in here and to fight. But if you're stuck out there for very long, then you're going to be in trouble. So if the British were able to forestall the German attack and somehow beat them back, and you'll see the British concentrations here in blue that are on that part of the slide here in these areas, that could put the Germans into a world of hurt. And indeed, that's almost exactly what happened. As the Germans penetrated into that rear, finally collapsing this area that was held by the Free French, the German units were almost surrounded themselves. And it was only after a coordinated attack took place through this region that the British line was broken and supplies could reach the armor and the mechanized troops that were penetrating into the British rear. And through the fighting that occurred in these areas that you'll see here, eventually the British were forced back. Now, when they're forced back, you'll see that here's Tobruk, right? Now, remember, Tobruk had held out for months in the previous time frame when Rommel came through the first time through. Only this time, the fortifications had not been kept up because the British had driven the French and the Italians all the way back to their start line. They were a long way away. But this is a different situation. So once the Gazala line collapses, Tobruk falls quickly. And when it falls, there are a great many captured, as you'll see here. And they're going to move back to where they can be transported back to Germany and Italy and put into prisoner of war camps. Rommel now has a port closer to his front line than he had before. He doesn't have to go all the way back the way he had to previously when Tobruk had not fallen. Benghazi was close, but again, not close enough. Tobruk brings him right up close. So even though port facilities are damaged to some degree, it's very quick for the Germans and Italians to begin offloading supplies and begin to move forward. Now you'll notice the time frame here. This is June of 42. This is a year after the war on the Eastern Front has been going on. We'll deal with the Eastern Front again at a much later lecture if anyone still wants to show up. But the point I'm trying to make is that the Eastern Front is still a very active front at this time. It's consuming enormous resources. There's nothing stagnant about it.
Michael?
Yes.
In 42, the Americans land to Rommel's rear in Morocco.
Not until November.
Very late. Okay, thank you.
Right. And that has a critical impact on things that'll happen as we reach this particular zenith, if you will, of the German-Italian attack across North Africa. As the Tobruk has fallen, now the Germans can penetrate and begin to attack in Egypt. And Mersa Matruh is one of the small towns on the coast. It's not a very worthwhile port. There's not much capability for offloading. But in terms of the British, they're trying to hold these areas. Notice there's an escarpment here and an escarpment here. And these are not easily crossed, but they're not as bad as the one up at Halfaya Pass outside of Tobruk that I showed you on an earlier slide. And again, the maneuver units are going to operate on the flank, and the infantry will tend to operate near the coast, along the coast road. Auchinleck is forced back there from there as well. And now he's falling back to the next defense. Here's Mersa Matruh, all right? Here's Tobruk. Here's the scale of miles. Notice the distance between here and here is over 300 miles. This is the only real port that you have, partly damaged. So offloading is slow, but at least you don't have to go 1,000 miles to bring supplies forward. Okay, you're coming through. You don't have any infrastructure here that's of help. You don't have a lot of water sources. You certainly don't have food sources or anything else. You have to bring everything with you. And what is important here is that Auchinleck is driven back to El Alamein. Now, this particular place, the Qattara Depression, is a sea of sand and basically not traversable by anything. I mean, if you think about when you've walked on a sandy beach, not on the part that's been covered by water where the sand is firm, but you walk where the water has disappeared and you just have loose sand, the effort it takes literally to walk a short distance. Well, you can't put a vehicle in there. It just isn't going to go. There were a few attempts, the long-range desert group that the British used to try to raid the rear of the German supplies and so on, might be able to sneak through, but these are very, very small units and they're really pinpricks in terms of what's going on. So once you get here, no large units are able to cross this whole area, which means the only open spot is between the sea coast and the edge of the Qattara Depression. In this particular situation, Auchinleck is realizing that he's got to develop some battle plans. He's replaced the 8th Army commander. He's taken it over himself. In fact, he lost a couple of army commanders way back when Rommel first assaulted in 42. But he's developed a defensive plan. But before it's really put into action, Rommel attacks and comes very close, as you can see, penetrating, getting in there and driving the British back. There's the Qattara Depression, here's the coast, right? He looks as though he might be triumphant. And of course, Rommel at this point is saying, just get me more stuff, and Cairo's very close, and if I take Cairo, the Suez Canal is cut. And if we end up taking the Suez Canal and cutting that supply route, who knows what's open in the Near East and Middle East? Maybe we can drive even further. And how grandiose the plan that at the same time, May, June, July, the Germans on the Eastern Front are driving down to the Caucasus. Gee, could we meet up? Well, you're talking 1,000 miles plus. Probably not going to happen, okay? But those are the kinds of thoughts that are beginning to resonate in Rommel's mind in particular. But he's beating the British. It looks like, again, they're going to suffer a catastrophic defeat, but they're able to stabilize the line. And now Churchill, who's upset with Auchinleck, says, time for you to go. And he's going to bring in this guy named Bernard Law Montgomery. Montgomery has experience from 1940 when the Germans attacked the British and French in May 1940. He's had effect in rebuilding units in England during the hiatus of trying to make sure that the Germans did not invade. And now here it is, 1942, that he's risen to command of the 8th Army. Montgomery's responsibilities are nowhere near as comprehensive as Alcala's. Remember what I showed you in an earlier slide, how many different places he had to consider in his responsibilities, how many different regions had to call on his resources and direction. Montgomery is not going to have that. He's only going to have the one spot to worry about, the 8th Army in this area, defense of North Africa. Now, I'm going to stop there because I want to emphasize a few other points before we shift into the next very critical element. And I want to let anyone ask questions about North Africa before we move on. Is there anyone on Zoom or any of you here who have any questions about what's been covered so far?
Well, Montgomery also had the advantage of the Cutter Depression, so Rommel could no longer outflank his left flank.
Right,
And
exactly.
that was a major help to him.
Right. The other important part of this, and I'm leaving the Battle of El Alamein and the retreat across North Africa and Torch Landings for another time, because I wanted to get into the idea of exactly the back and forth nature of what's going on, the various strategic elements that were involved, and the decisions that had to be made at the highest levels of how many resources to allocate. What are you going to protect? What are you going to do in terms of ensuring supply when you know that you're going to lose a lot of those supplies trying to get to the theater of operations? And how do you determine who's most capable or talented in doing it? If we begin to really look down in the weeds, you'll find even in biographies, it's very difficult to define what it is that led a particular commander to be successful, and another one who seemed to have a similar set of choices be not successful. One of the things that I haven't talked at all about, though I alluded to in terms of the Custer slide about what happens when you have poor intelligence and things of that sort, has to do with the amazing intelligence gathering capabilities of the Allies in this. You may have heard about Ultra and Magic and the Enigma machine and things of this sort, and those are phenomenal things. It's worth having a little insight into how those pieces of information filtered through from high command down to the theater commanders and what they were allowed to know or not know, which would hopefully keep the Allied knowledge of those particular structures from being understood by their opponents. For example, the Germans tried to land many spies in both the United States and in England. I believe that practically all of them were captured and some were turned as double agents. So they were fed information to send back to Germany, which was just close enough, but not really revealing things and how this all played a huge role, particularly when you come to the Normandy invasion. There was a term, bodyguard of lies, that I think Hitler used in order to express the kind of misinformation or disinformation that would be offered out to the public, that is to your opponent, and have them not appreciate what it was that you were actually going to do. So, all right, I'll take the next half hour to discuss the beginning part of the Pacific Theater. Beg your tolerance for that. I can understand that everyone may be getting a little bit antsy, but I think it's valuable for us to take this time. And again, I'll use this Gary Larson slide as a beginning, that this was something that the Americans in particular failed to appreciate about the Japanese. And to some extent, it was also true of the Russians. At different times, one forgets that sometimes there's something you didn't know about your opponent's capabilities, which can come out to hurt you, as this particular slide shows you. I don't know if you can read that. Yeah, you can. Okay. figure on Rexpo. All right. Now, a bit of a recap as to what leads up to what I call the actual beginning of World War II. Up until this particular event, there are two separate arenas of conflict that are really not connected in any military sense. There's the European War, which involves that part of North Africa and the Atlantic Ocean, things of that nature. But it hasn't yet reached the Pacific region or Asia. That doesn't mean that fighting wasn't going on. As I talked about in previous lectures, Japan and China were at each other for a considerable period of time. And this is just simply to demonstrate to us all what was going on in the Far Eastern theater. And what I want to point out is that things really began to escalate in Asia in 1937. And by the time of 1941, the Japanese had not only taken over Manchukuo and much of northern China, but they had also convinced the Vichy French that they were going to have Japanese troops in Indochina. And since the French couldn't do anything about it, they agreed rather than say, no, whatever's there, you're going to have to fight to take. From their standpoint, their view was, okay, you can base troops there until you've conquered China and then you're going to withdraw. Yeah, right. If you look at the Japanese intentions as they themselves expressed, and we've heard this term, the Far Eastern co-prosperity sphere, that the idea was that all of the Eastern Asian countries would be brought under one sort of European Union, called it an Asian Union. Of course, it would be run by the Japanese, subject to their complete control, but it would become a place where all of the colonists from the Netherlands and Britain and France and so on would be cast out. So the lands would be returned to the indigenous populations, except the Japanese would control it all. All right. And I emphasize again, importantly, the impact of ideology here, because the Japanese had a very specific approach and attitude towards what was going on and what their intentions were, not necessarily expressed completely in their propaganda, such as expressed in that particular phrase. And I'm going to just bring you a couple of phrases which I think will highlight the nature of that. The thing to remember also is that even unlike Germany and the Allied countries, Japan was a very homogeneous, ethnically homogeneous nation. There were some, we'll call it sub-nations, if you will, that involved in it. For example, Okinawans were not quite the same as native Japanese from the home islands and so on. But within the Japanese construct, there was a particular importance in their philosophy. Now, one of them was called Hako Ichiu, and I apologize to anyone who knows Japanese better than I. What that translates into is bringing the 8 corners of the world under one roof. Now think of the implications of that. The idea is that one roof will be Japan. And other parts of the world that they're talking about, not the entire globe. I mean, they didn't have that much hubris. But their feeling was that we are the dominant race. It is our mission to control these areas. If you keep that in mind, you'll begin to realize how the Japanese treated indigenous populations. Now, we've already seen examples of that and how they treated the Chinese when they took over various areas, the rape of Nanking being one of the most obvious and well documented of the atrocities that were occurred. If you think about what it takes for an individual to go into a town or a city, having fought to take it, and now what you're left with is the civilian population. Now, in that, the Japanese approach was that these people don't matter. We can do with them what we wish. That means rape, that means murder, as we wish. And there are stories after stories after stories where Japanese soldiers tied Chinese civilians to posts and practiced using the bayonet. So this kind of thing, if you think about what it takes to tie someone to a post like this and stick a bayonet in them, what's your mindset? That person wasn't necessarily a soldier. It might have been a young person. It might have been some old guy that just happened not to get out of harm's way. What does it take for you to do that? A certain moral ascendancy. In addition, you've heard the term Bushido, the way of the warrior. In Japanese culture and in a sense in their ethics, this had to do with a couple of very important things. One was being a warrior was the best occupation, if you want to call it that you could have. Because there were embodied all of the physical elements and the moral elements that go along with manliness, if we want to use a Western term. But it meant you also subjected yourself to the mission that was put in front of you, and you would contest with anyone to the utmost of your strength, the limits of your ability, and even the limit of your life. Now, tied in with that was another Japanese phrase called Kodo-ha, the way of the emperor, or sometimes called the Showa restoration, though I think that is more of a perversion of it. And the main elements involved there were a distrust of the, of the wealthy and of the class of merchants and things of this sort. So from the standpoint of how the Japanese felt about themselves and what their culture demanded of them, the idea here was that they would do whatever they needed, and surrender, for example, was not an option. It also meant that if your opponent surrendered, that he was less than a warrior and therefore shamed in the eyes of your own interpretation of your culture. So when the Japanese took prisoners who had surrendered, such as we'll talk about when we come to the Philippines and Singapore and the Dutch East Indies and things of that nature, the Japanese felt little compunction about treating them well. Now, from a legal standpoint, the Japanese had not signed the Geneva Convention. They alleged that they would treat prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, but that did not occur in many circumstances. So, for example, it was perfectly reasonable to do what I described earlier, or as a number of Japanese themselves reported in their memoirs or revealed in other personal oral histories, they would practice beheading civilians. You know, they'd tie their hands behind their back, have them kneel down, and then they'd get their samurai sword out, which for them was not ceremonial. Indeed, if you look back at samurai tradition, if you drew your sword out of its scabbard, it had to have blood on it before you put it back in. That meant you might even just cut yourself, but you could not just put it back in. And Japanese officers carried those into battle, not as ceremonial swords. They intended to use them and did if they were able to get close enough. So we have to keep these elements in mind, or much of what happens in the Pacific theater gets lost. And we have to understand this basic history, because now we're going to come to some critical elements that influence what was going on. Now, this particular slide is not China's Belt and Road Initiative or the first and second island chain, which is what their strategy has been as they've described it themselves, but rather what the Japanese had planned for themselves in terms of their ultimate strategy. Now, oftentimes, and in particular, when one looks at modern movies on the Pacific theater, especially in the beginning part of the war, and with a special emphasis on Admiral Yamamoto, a name many of you might have heard of, there's a distortion in what is understood by the Japanese about going to war with America, England, and the Netherlands in particular. The Japanese at this particular time frame, leading up to the war, had been enormously successful since the turn of the century in contesting with Western powers. I'll call Russia a Western power, although it had an obvious Eastern presence. We talked about that in lectures far back on the Russia-Japanese War. But the Japanese had been ascendant over a period of now nearly 50 years in the Pacific Asian Rim. They recognized very clearly that while their technology had now gained enormously from their almost feudal existence in the early 1800s, over just a period of 100 years, that in order to maintain a viable modern society, they needed resources, and the islands of Japan were clearly insufficient for that. So a good part of the impetus of taking Manchuria, Manchukuo, had to do with gathering resources. But modern technology required something of even greater importance to them, and that was oil. Japan had little oil of its own. Manchuria did not offer much in the way of oil. Where was the oil? Down here in the East Indies. If the Japanese did not have oil of their own, that meant they had to import it. Prior to the war, where did most of their oil come from? Not from down here. There's a country way over here on the other side of the Pacific, known as the United States, that provided up to 80% of the oil needs for Japan. Why does this matter? Because as the United States politically became more and more concerned with Japanese actions in China, we began to impose sanctions. Once we got to the point of cutting off iron and steel, which Japan was importing in large amounts, that sent a message to them. Your economy can be wrecked with further actions on our part. And when China was now under vigorous assault, the United States said, we're going to cut off your oil. Now, Japan's reserves were sufficient for perhaps a year, after which it was felt their economy and their military would collapse utterly. Now ask yourselves, you're a Japanese, and you've bought into a fair degree into the philosophies that I've outlined before. You have a certain sense of your moral superiority, not undeserved in some ways, because a lot of their encounter with early people from Europe was not very favorable. I mean, they were dirty and grubby and just didn't have the kind of class action that the Japanese were seeing among themselves. They thought these Gaijin were really pretty bad folks. Barbarians was the other term that used. So now your economy is threatened. And you're being told by the United States that all of the sacrifices you have just put on the table for 4 years plus of fighting in China, with all the costs to you, all of the damage you've taken, all the people who've been killed, forget the Chinese, the Japanese don't care about them. That's not their point. Is, are you going to turn around and say, oh, gee, we're sorry, we'll leave. We'll go back home. And then you can turn the oil tap back on. But what's the message there? Well, if you Japanese misbehave again in a way we don't like, we'll turn the tap off. And you're going to have to do what we tell you to do. What nation, much less one that views itself with the kind of moral superiority the Japanese felt was their right, is going to listen to that? So what's your choice? Now, remember I said about lack of intelligence, not appreciating your capabilities of your enemy, and so on and so forth. What do we hear from many historians? We hear that, oh, the Japanese didn't really appreciate how powerful the United States was. No, that's not true at all. Both the Japanese Army and the Japanese Navy knew America had the potential economically to be extraordinarily powerful and dangerous. So the phrases that you will run across if you want to watch some really good movies on the subject, and I'll recommend them to you in a minute, seem to highlight that somehow only Yamamoto appreciated that. That's not true at all. But the Japanese high command were faced with a choice. We've been fighting in China for years. Are we going to just knuckle under and do what the Americans tell us to do? Or are we going to grab the resources we need to remain a vital economy and military force that has shown its superiority against the West in a number of areas? And we're going to control those resources so we can control our own destiny. That's the ultimate issue. Now, the perimeters that I'm showing on this slide represent not Japanese hubris, but what they recognized was necessary if they were to remain secure and in control of those resources. Just as Hitler needed to push the Russians back far enough so German sources, manufacturing and oil would not be subject to Russian bombers, the Japanese recognized they had to push far enough east and control a great enough distance to be able to keep the Americans at bay. What about the British? The Japanese had little inclination, though they got sucked into a bit of a trap regarding India, but they knew that the British fleet in India was not up to their standard at all. And indeed, the only threat that the British fleet offered them at all, which was not a great threat, was the British fleet at Singapore. What about the Americans? The Americans had a small Pacific fleet in the Philippines, basically cruisers, destroyers, some submarines, no capital ships worth noting. And the American fleet back in 40 was based on the West Coast. It wasn't until later that it was moved to the Pearl Harbor location, which was a message again to the Japanese saying, we're out there, okay? Don't mess around. We've got our fleet in Pearl. The Japanese knew that manufacturing in the United States was much greater than the Japanese were capable of doing. So from their particular standpoint, if we are to control resources and we're to hold the Americans at bay, the best way to do that is to control a series of island bases which can serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers, some of which can be developed into reasonable ports at which we can base powerful naval units. And when the Americans finally start to come back across the Pacific to take us down, however they were going to do it, then we could pummel that fleet en route with aircraft based on land, and then use our naval fleet to come up and destroy the remnants. We won't defeat the United States in the sense that we're going to occupy Washington. Okay? What we're going to do is we're going to gain enough time that our defensive perimeter will be powerful enough that when the Americans do gear up and come, they're going to take a real beating. And ultimately we'll say, you know something, it isn't worth it. Okay. The Japanese were not planning to invade New Zealand. They weren't planning to invade Australia. They weren't planning to invade India. They wanted the resources they could control in Southeast Asia and in the Indies. Once we have that, we'll be secure enough. And we don't have to listen to other people telling us what to do. Now, I want this slide to give you an idea, which is difficult to see from maps because maps change the legend. This shows you just the size of Indonesia compared to Europe. Pretty impressive. Now, the Americans and the British to some extent understood time and distance involved in naval warfare. We'd been practicing it for years. We had some understanding of that. But when you begin to look at what I have emphasized repeatedly, the logistical construction that is required to occupy different areas, and see that those defensive perimeters bases that you've set up are supplied and engaged, you're talking about enormous distances. So getting there is half the fun, so to speak. And it gives you an idea of how complex this whole engagement was going to be. And one of the things that bears understanding and emphasis is that the Japanese did an incredible job of planning. When you begin to look at some of the details, as we will to some extent when we go to the next and final lecture of this series, you begin to see just how meticulous the planning was, how well done it was, and how extraordinarily well executed it was. I mean, it is phenomenal to think of how they could put this together over vast distances involving hundreds, if not 1,000 ships and 1 million men over distances that are extraordinary, where the only routes of supply were primarily naval. Not like having roads and railways. Okay, they don't work here. So all of the planning that goes into it, from the very way you construct your military forces, how you can construct an amphibious landing, what you're going to do to provide support to the amphibious units that are landing, what kind of supplies are going to be given to them and continue to be given to them in order to execute the plans that you've outlined. Even if what your opponent has is deficient in comparison to what you have as an attacker, defense is much more efficient. You need fewer people to be successful than you do if you're an attacker. And yet, time after time after time, the Japanese showed themselves to be quite superior, that little Rambo dog, all right? Mm-hmm. That we did not appreciate just how good they were. And on top of it, just as the Russians surprised the Japanese, the Germans with some of their technological advances, the Japanese did the same to us. Their Zero aircraft was faster, more maneuverable than anything we had. Their pilots had been trained to the 10th degree. They were phenomenal pilots. The deficiency on the part of the Zero was its lack of armor and its lack of self-sealing fuel tanks. But it meant they were faster, could fly higher, and turn more quickly. So that meant they could get around American aircraft and shoot them down. Not only was the Zero better, but the Val, their dive bomber, and the Kate, the torpedo bomber, were better. And they had better torpedoes, and they had better night fighting capabilities by far, as we'll see in later lectures when we get into those areas. None of these things were appreciated to the great degree that we began to appreciate them once they did more than bloody our nose. So planning, logistical support, the technology which they developed specifically for the fighting they anticipated doing, the old idea of train as you fight, fight as you train, was something they incorporated very, very well. And despite the controversies between the Japanese Army and Navy high commands, which were bitter throughout much of the conflict, yet what they accomplished in just a few months over extraordinary distances is just incredible. Now, I'm going to stop here for a minute because I want to mention a couple of films related to the Pacific Theater in particular. One classic movie, Tora, 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 back from, I think, 1970s, is, I think, without a doubt, one of the best ever made on the attack on Pearl Harbor. In some ways, it's better than documentaries because you're there seeing how both sides are thinking and reacting to the situation. I already alluded, though, to a couple of things which I think distort some of the images because for the Americans in particular, Yamamoto was sort of like the German Rommel. He was someone who was an extraordinary intelligence, an aggressive fighter. He had flaws, and the flaws are demonstrated pretty quickly in a number of different areas. But he also had a very deep understanding, at least as portrayed through many of the movies and biographies, of what America was capable of doing. He had studied at Harvard for a period of time. He'd been a naval attaché in America. He knew America. The famous phrases related to him. When asked how successful would the Japanese be under his plan, he said, "I can run rampant for 6 months to a year. After that, all bets are off." And indeed, he was prescient almost to the day when you think about what happened. He also said that I fear that we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a fierce resolve. And that indeed was true. I think that he was perhaps more cognizant of how America would respond than were others, but that is separate from appreciating the enormous economic potential of the United States. Indeed, when you look at what the United States did in its production capabilities, it is staggering. It is just hard to comprehend what we did in that conflict. The other part with it is that the implication is that other people in Japan, other military leaders, did not understand what was happening, what was capable, the United States being capable of doing. And as I pointed out earlier, I don't think that's the case. I think that the Japanese military were more than aware of it. It's just that circumstances turned against them dramatically as a result of several bad decisions by Yamamoto himself. Now, in terms of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the more recent film, I think it's titled Pearl Harbor, has a bit of romance thrown in and so on. The battle scenes are pretty good, particularly some of the triage that the nurse does in it, but it is too much of a romance. It's not quite there. The battle scenes, of course, are very good. There's a film on, it's either Amazon Prime or Netflix, which is worth looking at, called the Archimedes Battle, I believe it's called. And it has to do with the construction of the Yamato, the super battleship. The Japanese built the biggest battleship ever built, ever. They built two of them, the Musashi and the Yamato. And the story about that is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And the insights into arguments that were going on in the Naval High Command itself are worth hearing, just in terms of watching it. It's really worth it. It's really worth it. The film Midway, which is from, I think, 2019, is also quite good in a lot of different ways. It tends to, again, promote Yamamoto a bit as, you know, this philosopher warrior and so on. I don't really care for some of those scenes. I don't think they're done properly, but that's me as a movie critic. But again, the scenes are very well done. And it covers some of the essential elements that lead up to and involve the Battle of Midway itself, a critical point in the Pacific War. Oh, good Lord. They're telling me time's over. I'll turn that off.
Must be 3 o'clock.
The clock says 4. I went an hour over. Well, listen, we're going to deal with the Pacific Theater next time. And I'll take us through, hopefully, a number of points that I hope will interest you and intrigue you. But I would like you to take a few minutes to look at the collection of books that Greg brought, because these are accessible to you. They're very readable. They're not dense and, you know, complex and difficult, nor are they terribly expensive if you want to buy them. But they're worth the effort. And I thank you for your attendance. I'll stay in it to answer any questions, engage in any conversation that you like.
Michael,
Don't forget the
letters
public
from
library.
Iwo Jima,
I'm sorry?
letters from Iwo Jima,
Yeah, that's a good one for later in the war.
great movie.
Flags of Our Fathers is the other side of that. Well worth looking. Both of those are Clint Eastwood films.
Yeah, don't forget the public library.
The